When I was 12 years old, I joined my first online community, Gaia Online. We were all just kids, talking about anime and collecting goblins. When everyone hides behind a colorful avatar and cute names, it's easy to make new friends and talk to people. Get to know different people. I live in Europe, and I made a lot of friends from all over the world in those days. Australians, Koreans, Canadians, all kinds of people as the months turned into years, and Gaia Online grew more and more, and only one friend remained, Jacob. He lived in a Winnipeg suburb of Manitoba. Despite the big time difference, we would usually meet online for an hour or two each day and play MMOs together. We started to see that the time difference in the guild actually worked to our advantage, as we could take turns controlling most of the hours. Over the years I switched to journalism and didn't have time for games. Jacob got his dental degree, and that hour became an hour a week, then a month, and when I turned 25 I realized we hadn't spoken in a year, and I liked he posted on Facebook, but it was a face I had known for the past year. We reconnected. We stayed up until midnight. We talked after dinner. We talked about the union that was still run by the people we took with us, and where life was taking us. As we talked, I asked him why him. I wanted to be a dentist. That wasn't something I thought to ask. It seemed like you had to ask something. Just assumed the reason was that his father, who was a dentist, told me that he, like the others, thought it was a wrong family business, and hadn't really thought of any other reason why it would seem like a stable job, and his father had always seemed happy about it. Jacob looked a bit sad after talking about it, like he hadn't thought about why he did it. I personally don't understand. Teeth are weird. We talked again a week later, and discussed the possibility of me going there. Meeting the family, maybe going fishing, maybe bring a laptop for old school gaming, stuff like that. We went back to talking about his job, and he mentioned thinking about it. I asked him he thought about it a lot. I seem to have this weird memory, he said. When I was a kid, in the house we lived in, my aunt worked weekends from Friday night to Monday morning. So my dad would go to her house on Saturday to feed the cats. I noticed Jacob wasn't telling me specifically at this point. It was like he was saying to himself, and I found myself in the same place that needed to be removed. It was strange that he had a tone of voice that I had never heard before. I could almost hear him screaming as he continued that my father had been badly injured one summer. He had been in an accident. He had broken both his hands. His left hand was rotting, and he had been out for months, during which time he needed someone to take care of my aunt's cats. It was really dangerous. It was very dangerous. I was only 8. My older sisters were 10 and 12, but somehow she had never asked them to go instead. I'm sure I'll be the one to do it, and then I have to be quiet. We don't want to be hanging around your aunt's house. That's unethical. He told me the first Saturday when I went to feed the cats. My dad stopped me on the road and said, "Get a metal bucket and a small rock hammer." He said to feed the cats, check the walls for teeth. That's all he said. Check the walls for teeth. Be specific. I didn't even read it. I had no idea what it meant, but the way what he said was as if I had a gun to my head. I hadn't been in my aunt's shoes, and I couldn't imagine her face. I may not have met her to this day. I don't remember seeing him at that moment. Jacob would get angry, and sometimes he would stop to take a deep breath. There was a short laugh. I didn't know what to say, and I never had a chance to add anything to the conversation that he continued to have at home in this big apartment, the empty space. He stood like a wart and smelled of oils and damp wood. There was not a scrap of paint left, just bare boards and concrete. Even the house key looked out of place, one of those big pieces of iron that rust my fingers inside the bare walls, worse with crumpled wallpaper. Everything was visible. The floorboards were everywhere, and there was no furniture left except the linen-covered sofa, which had been torn in half, and the bookshelf that had been thrown into the middle of the hallway. I moved from room to room with a rock hammer and a bucket, and in one of the back rooms I saw them. First on my thumb, 6 big rows of teeth pulled out of the wall, like today, warm to the touch with a rock hammer. I hit them one by one. They left holes in the wall. Something moved in them, roots, maybe one by one. I stuck them in a bucket. That was all summer. I came home every Saturday, and sometimes I checked the teeth on the ceiling, or I found a thumb on the floor. Sometimes small like a tic-tac-toe, sometimes big like one. They were tricky. They always showed up in new places, standing behind a dozen couches that I had forgotten to move during the first few weeks of late summer. I filled a few buckets with large crooked teeth for my father and never mentioned it. He just said he wanted a boy. I did it at the end of the summer. I got the hammer and bucket back, and my father went back to feeding the cats regularly for years. I needed to stop thinking about it. Jacob told me his father had died a few years ago and that there was no one in that old house. I didn't know what to say at this time. He is just worried. I have never heard him this way before. He remembers all this. That summer was like a dream, Jacob said, so strange in a way. It was the most realistic thing I wanted. That time passed like it never happened. You know what I mean. She quickly apologized and mumbled something about walking her dog, and we didn't talk after that, but we tried to check the messages to see if she was okay, but our conversation became more superficial. Nostalgia can last for a while until reality sets in. The last I heard from him was 2 months ago, when he told me he had to go back to that old house. He wanted to know if this summer was real or not. I got a message from him that I was going to feed the cats. I didn't hear from him because the number was disconnected. I tried to call his wife, Arlene, but at first she didn't want to talk to me. I thought I was a bad influence on Jacob and partly blamed me for bringing him up. The whole situation to their door, even though she had come back to me about 3 weeks ago, and all the leads he had pursued seemed to have come to nothing, and he thought he could hear what I was saying. I had to say, so I told him all about Jacob's brain, about her childhood memories. But it wasn't until she mentioned her aunt's house outside the house that she seemed to know about this place we were in. Once Arlene didn't say where her aunt was, but her childhood. From the description of the house I gave her, she was able to narrow down the search to the house Jacob had mentioned, and despite my warnings, Arlene insisted on going there to look for Jacob, leaving their daughter with her sister for the weekend. She promised to keep my promise that I would be on the phone all weekend if she needed to talk, and Arlene was ready after hearing my news. Who would believe the story but the man who told her? She finally found a house with surprisingly little problem. Once you knew what to look for, it was easy for others to spot. It was just a rundown building you passed on your way west. Arlen described it as an old, one-story house, cheap wood paneling over solid concrete. Not a single blade of grass grew there, and all the windows were covered with iron bars and sheet metal was bolted tightly inside. Arlene works part-time as a real estate agent, so she knows a few tricks that others don't. I can't get to a lot of the gates that aren't actually locked, but are hidden, concealed, or simply forgotten. Arlene knew where to look and found her way under the house. He didn't stop for a long time, and the whole place was littered with stuff. The ammonia that nearly choked him, he came back the next day with a hammer and started to break one of those back windows. He couldn't bend the iron bars, but the wood itself was partially rotted, so when he started working on the frame he noticed the same thick ammonia smell coming from the wood itself. I can't confirm that. He told me he was feeling nauseous for an hour later. The cops came. It wasn't the best idea to try to break into a very visible house in the middle of the day. She was charged with trespassing and questioned as Arlene explained she was looking for her husband. There was a moment of change in attitude. The officers asked Arlene for a description of Jacob, and it turned out they knew who John Doe was talking about. They said yes, it was him. Arlene was taken to the cells. She recognized Jacob right away, even though he looked like hell. He was wearing the same black jacket he had when he first left, the same jeans and shirt. One of his shoes was missing, his hair was frizzy and dry, his breath smelled like ammonia. He wouldn't even look up when she hugged him. Arlene said he was just sitting there. Jacob was in some sort of shock, and the officers found him sleeping while walking down the main road, leaving blood dripping from his shoes. They tried to talk to him or find some sort of identification but couldn't do anything. They managed to wash his feet but didn't know what to do with him. They weren't even sure he was asleep because he had been asleep for days before they found the lights, as if they were on, but they were dim, Arlene explained after identifying Arlene with no one in the house. Jacob was taken to a nearby clinic, and was released because the officers could not get him to move voluntarily. Once at the clinic, Jacob was cleared and had a series of urine and saliva blood tests and a series of X-rays, mainly to look at the leg but also for head trauma and a sprained leg. But physically, Arlene noticed something on the X-rays. Her wisdom teeth were still there. She said they should not have been removed after a year. Engagement. This all happened about 3 weeks ago, and there was also talk of seeing a therapist because her reaction was that someone had been through a trauma, Arlene told me, so she made an appointment with the dentist to have her wisdom teeth checked. Since she had never heard of them, she explained how strange it was that Jacob came home, did not react at all to seeing his daughter, and his behavior was completely out of character, sitting completely still all night. And then all of a sudden she just bursts into the bathroom to look at her reflection in the mirror, then roll over on the couch or bed and sometimes look up at the ceiling, moaning, Arlene explained, not just quietly, almost screaming as if she was trying to make some sound. It was too much for her lungs for their daughter, so they sent her to her grandparents until her father recovered. The specialist found nothing, no danger or head trauma. Her hearing and vision were fine, and Jacob still responded to sound and light. You seem to care that the therapist wasn't doing any better, and there was no way to get him to talk. You could get him to focus on your finger if you held it up to him, but he quickly lost interest. Arlene explained in the dim light. No one was home, after all. There was a dentist. They'd gotten there early in the morning and were the first patients of the day. I knew Arlene had questions about Jacob's wisdom teeth and wanted to do a proper checkup as soon as she opened Jacob's mouth and he was overbitten. Arlene said this is what they call Jacob. He had severe hyperdontia. In layman's terms, there are too many teeth. Almost all the teeth in the second row, canines, premolars, molars, almost every type of tooth except the incisors. She was in the clinic for only a few days after the x-rays. No one can grow a set of teeth in a few days. Teeth don't come and go as they please. It's been a week and nothing has improved in the 4 rows of teeth. Some teeth are shrinking, some growing. Jacob couldn't properly. His mouth was closed, his jaw was a little tight, and breathing was difficult. Arlene tried her best to find a specialist, but there were so many questions about Jacob's condition. No one realized he could have spontaneous hyperdontia, and he started to smell ammonia. She tried to bathe him, but it was difficult to bathe him. All she could do was get him into the shower. Arlene had to stop the shower because Jacob inhaled the water without thinking. His instinct to hold his breath was gone. He gasped for air for a few nights before Arlene finally called for me. Jacob started one of his fits and ran to the bathroom. This time it was different. He was making horrible, cat-like coughing sounds, and the entire sink was littered with teeth scattered, more than 20. There was blood everywhere. Arlene picked up 1 or 2, and tried to stop the bleeding by stuffing a cloth into his mouth, but Jacob didn't react. His breathing improved immediately. His jaw was reset. Each additional tooth came out on its own after a short trip to the doctor, and on the night of Jacob's discharge he was recovering well. Arlene had been up all night, so when they got home she fell asleep on the couch. By this point she had spent weeks pent up in anxiety, which was taking its toll, and she woke up 11 hours later to find Jacob sitting next to her on the couch smiling. She was actually saying good morning, 1 word in weeks, and all of a sudden eye contact in good morning. The lights came back on suddenly. It was as if everything was back to normal overnight. Jacob felt much better, but he agreed that he probably shouldn't go back to work for a while. He was in a strange state that I can't explain. He was back to his old self, although he was still a little sore. He was sure that his mouth was improving, probably fast, but his oral hygiene had been lacking for some time. His gums were still discolored, and things were starting to get back to normal. Normal, it was just a few days ahead of Arlene. I was ready to put it all behind me. I wasn't even going to call you, but there was one thing I couldn't ignore, and that was what happened to the teeth I spat out and didn't clean them even after her daughter came home and life went back to normal. Arlene swore there was something strange about Jacob. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and hear doors opening and closing furniture. About 2 nights ago, Arlene seemed to be asleep, watching him sneak into the kitchen, crawl under the sink and gently kick something softly. Instead of hitting it, Arlene checked under the sink that day. I know it sounds crazy. Just crazy. Arlene said there were dozens of teeth under the sink and gently put the baby down with the rock hammer. Arlene has no idea what to do and I don't know what to say to her. I thought this nightmare was over, but it's getting worse. I just found a tooth in the trash can and it doubled in number. And she drowned under her daughter stubbed her toe on the dog as she was getting ready to go to school the next day. Her teeth returned to the walls and Jacob put her there, clenching his teeth.
And so, the story ends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button to receive all the stories. Like, share and rate the story in a comment. Thank you for watching.